Welcome everybody. I'm happy to see so many people here for the lectures that we are having today, because I know it's going to be a very interesting one. Yagil Levy is an associate professor at the Department of Sociology, Political Science and Communication at the Open University in Israel, and he's currently the Aaron and Cecile Goldman visiting professor in the Department of Government at Georgetown University. He's an old friend of mine, and I'm lucky to be his friend and colleague, because for the last several years he was really the leader of the military sociologists in Israel. He wrote 6 books, 70 articles. He has a very original approach to the issue. He knows a lot. He publishes a lot. He has, in the last several years, developed very interesting, not only perception, but theories about the role of the military in Israeli society. He doesn't deal with military strategy, but he can. Some of his articles also showed how the sociological base of the military had a major impact on the military operations. For example, the interesting question that was discussed in the last several years about civilian casualties. Why were there so many civilian casualties in the Gaza operation in 2006? A question which looks very technical, if you want, from a military point of view, but Yagil's approach can show how the sociological base of the military has an impact on even things like that. So it's a very original approach, which tells a lot about a field that is very much discussed both in Israel and outside Israel. And I'm looking forward to his presentation today, which is on the latest topic, which very many people, both in Israel and outside, both academics and laymen, are asking themselves, namely the process of hadata, a new word in Hebrew, which was translated by us as religionization, but Yagil uses another term. He uses the term of theocratization.
Theocratization, yeah.
So you should tell us what's a better word to use for this new term, hadata, which comes from the word dat, religion. I won't spend more time because I would like him to talk, so Yagil, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Yoram, for this nice introduction. You just forgot to mention that the first chapter on Israeli politics and society I got from you as a professor at the Tel Aviv University. May I mention how long years ago?
All right.
It's hard to hear.
Ah, all right. So we have to. Mike.
That microphone.
That's yours?
It's
So you simply have to talk. I see. So
No, but I have my
No,
mic.
that's only recording into my recorder, so you'll just need to speak up.
And that records what?
That records also into my recorder, but that's not hooked up to it.
Okay, I will speak up.
Speak up. Speak up. Just speak up.
Okay, thank you very much for coming in. Thank you very much, Professor Perry, for your invitation. Thank you very much, Professor Menken, for your invitation. It's a really honor to be here with you today and to share some thoughts about the struggle that the Israel Defense Forces, the IDF, is embroiled in over its identity and character during the last years. It is not for nothing that I have chosen this topic. I think that its implications go far beyond the relatively narrow scope of relations between military and society in Israel. I think that the implications of this topic, of this struggle, may concern many American policymakers and other Americans caring about the future of Israel as well. And that's why I bother you today with something which seems to be internal issue of the state of Israel. As you know, today is the Israeli Independence Day. And Independence Day and the Memorial Day yesterday are always good opportunities to focus again on relations between military and society in Israel. And with your help, we will take advantage of this opportunity. As you know, I guess, Israel is among the very few democracies in the world in which conscription survives. And by nature, conscription dictates the coexistence of different groups with different identities within the ranks. And therefore, the military is called to do what the sociologists call to manage diversity. Indeed, during the last decade, struggle has emerged between two contradictory trends within the military: liberalization versus theocratization. I will describe today this contradiction and the cultural conflict which has gradually emerged within the ranks. Similar to its Western counterparts, the Israeli military has experienced a transition from a modern to postmodern military. If we draw on concepts offered a while ago by American military sociologists, the most important and famous was the late Charles Moskos. Similar processes account for this trend, most important of which was the declining motivation to bear military sacrifice. It was especially prevalent during and since the 1980s, especially among the secular middle class, once the historical social backbone of the IDF. A drop in the prestige of the military following deficiencies in 1973 war, October War, and later in the Lebanese arena. Disputes in Israeli politics over the use of force. The transition of Israeli society into a liberal market society. Sense of declined external threats following the peace treaty with Egypt in 1978. All of these processes accounted for the decline in motivation to sacrifice, and again, especially among the elite groups. To adjust itself to the new trend, the IDF gradually modified its organizational culture towards a more liberal format. And there are several processes that are worth mentioning. First, the eroded legitimation of sacrifice, especially among the elite groups, generated what can be called the casualty-averse policies. And they became a central consideration in the military policies since the 1980s. This spirit accounted for the political military restraint that, for instance, drove the Israeli government to twice pull out Israeli forces from Lebanon, first in 1985 and later in 2000s. In both cases, under massive political pressures motivated by bereavement. Second, the military liberalized military discipline. For instance, it gave parents almost unlimited access to their sons and daughters' commanders, and later bargained with these commanders over the terms of conditions of service of their children. Liberalization extended to the soldiers themselves, who bargaining with their commanders on the same issues. The ability to cancel or shorten military service due to what is called mental health issues was a major expression of this bargaining power of the soldiers, sometimes with assistance of their parents. Consequently, conscription in the IDF became selective. And since the beginning of the 2000s, 25% of potential Jewish male draftees do not take part in military service. Only half of this related to the exemption of ultra-Orthodox, on which I elaborate in a moment. Third, liberalization encompassed a growing concern with ethical dilemmas, which evolved during the new battlefield. First in Lebanon, and second in Gaza, and the West Bank battlefield, in which the military is engaging with the civilian population, and not necessarily also with, not necessarily with conventional armies. Monitored by civil rights NGOs from outside, and by dissident groups of soldiers from within, the IDF restrained the use of force, especially in the Palestinian arena, which is the road to the Oslo agreements with the Palestinians in 1993. Fourth, liberalization extended to issues of gender. The IDF was among the most liberal militaries in the world in its approach to restrict, to eliminate any restrictions to the promotion of gays and lesbians in the military in 1993. 3 years later, the military responded to the High Court of Justice ruling that it could not exclude qualified women from pilot training, and the military opened this pilot training to women. Beyond implementing this specific verdict, the IDF largely expanded women's access to combat roles and opened previously closed roles. To a large extent, liberalization could have progressed further if it has not provoked a counter-reaction by religious soldiers, and especially their leadership. Until the 1970s, religious soldiers were usually excluded from significant positions within the IDF, mainly in combat, because of their fears about coming into close contact with secular conscripts in mixed combat units, and the potential for secularizing impact. This anxiety led many religious soldiers into auxiliary and other roles, but not combat, and away from the option of military career. Demographically, 20% of the Jewish male population in Israel is Orthodox, 60% of whom define themselves as religious. About 40% are defined as ultra-Orthodox, Haredi, namely members of the most theological conservative wing of Judaism. While the Orthodox serve in the drafted military, the ultra-Orthodox are exempted in accordance with a historical deal between the secular ruling parties and the ultra-Orthodox leadership, deal that was originally aimed at reconstructing the yeshivas, the ultra-Orthodox yeshivas, after the Holocaust. Since the 1980s, an increasing number of Orthodox religious Jews, I emphasize Orthodox, not ultra-Orthodox religious Jews, particularly national religious Jews who link religion with national mission, have been joining the combat ranks. Two interacting factors account for this change. The first was the gradual recognition among the religious Zionist Jews that the time had come to challenge the secular middle class, the class that founded the state and was associated with the historical labor movement. The establishment of Gush Emunim movement, Bloc of Faithful, in 1974, the ideological foundation that underpinned the settlement project in the West Bank after the October 1973 war, marked a change within the National Religious Society. It was a shift from an ideology based on partnership with the secular Zionism to an attempt to subject the national project to religious principles, and hence to challenge the dominant secular paradigm. This factor overlapped with the declining motivation to serve among the secular middle class, as I mentioned earlier. While the liberalization of the IDF provided context and impetus to present a new conservative agenda. Religious use along with other lower class groups took advantage of this change in the military to fill the vacuum and to upgrade their position in the military. For the national religious group, upgrading its stronghold in the IDF meant promoting a new agenda as follows. First, forging an autonomous religious identity in the military. Not anymore identity which is part of a general secular identity of the military. Second, challenging the secular hegemony in the military, the embodiment of the old Israeliness, while depicting the secular group as weakly Jewish and as a liberal, material, and militarily defeatist group. Third, preserving the settlement project in the perceived Holy West Bank, which was put in peril following the allegedly incompetence of the secular middle class in the Palestinian arena, which generated the Oslo Accords. From a religious point of view, the Oslo signified a disaster. Fourth, desecularizing the military culture by instilling principle of religious culture among the units. It is part of a spiritual mission through which religious groups, if I quote two rabbis, could bring the fruits of Torah face to face with Israeli society. Gradually, the national religious group was presented in the public discourse as the new elite service of Israeli society, taking the place of the traditional secular elite, particularly the kibbutz movement, who was identified historically with the IDF. To promote its new agenda, the national religious group practically acted to theocratize the military culture. I say practically because it was not a matter of an explicit intended agenda guided by unified leadership, but rather a sequence of linear actions which gradually shaped a new reality. Four integrated and cumulative processes gradually generated this shift towards the theocratization of the Israeli military. And Yuval, please, if you can put, that's the only slide that I used today, just to present the process. The first process was crafting institutional arrangements that enabled the service of religious soldiers in the military. Thereby, and second, creating a critical mass of religious soldiers in many combat units. Consequently, and third, restricting the IDF command's inter-organizational autonomy vis-à-vis the religious sector. Consequently, and finally, restricting the IDF's autonomy in deploying forces in politically disputable areas. To begin, the first stage was institutional bargaining, which had been evolving since the 1980s between the military and organized religious groups to create cultural arrangements that enable religious groups use to serve in a secular military. Imposing the Jewish dietary laws, kashrut, and observing the Jewish Shabbat and other holidays were, of course, preconditions for this. But also the promotion of other special arrangements. Most important are pre-military Torah colleges, what is called in Hebrew mechinot, allowing many of the religious conscripts to defer their enlistment to study for a year in the college for what is called spiritual fortification. Another form is arrangement academies, called in Hebrew yeshivot esder, a special program that enable Torah study in yeshiva alongside combat service in homogeneously religious frameworks. These two frameworks reduce the probability that religious soldiers would be secularized during their military service. And both frameworks are managed and led by rabbis. As part of this process, the rabbis gained the IDF's recognition of their special status. For example, the rabbis had relatively free access to the camps in which their students serve. The students frequently turned to the rabbis for guidance about the interface between military and religion. For instance, the functioning of the military during the Shabbat. More importantly, the IDF has held dialogues with the heads of the yeshivas regarding the character and terms of military service. This created what sometimes is called a dual hierarchy, involving simultaneous subordination of part of the religious conscripts to both their officers and their rabbis. Successful bargaining led to the second process, the creation of a critical mass of religious soldiers in many combat units, especially from the mid-1990s. This was especially as military service became an important mobility track for many religious youths, particularly for those who were promoted to officer rank. To give you some numbers, in 2010, the graduates of religious pre-military colleges and arrangements academies, the organized forms of religious draftees, constituted about 10% of the Army's combat force, while the overall proportion of religious soldiers in the regular combat units is about 25 to 30%. And please don't let these numbers mislead you, because the concentration of religious conscripts in very specific units is, of course, more significant than the average numbers. A large percentage of religious soldiers comprise the infantry brigades, with a steep rise in the number of religious graduates of the infantry officers' course, which rise from only 2.5% in 1990 to 26% in 2008. The creation of this critical mass increased the impact of demands to create a theocratic military culture. Two efforts were significant. First was the theocratization of the military mission by ascribing religious meaning to the military deployment in the perceived only greater land of Israel, namely the occupied West Bank. However, theological cultural design has gone one step further with the progress of the peace talks with the Palestinians following the Oslo Accords of 1993. Since then, rabbis have issued religious decisions, Piskei Halacha, that focused on professional issues and subjected military discipline to theological considerations. For example, rabbis established rules banning religious soldiers from participating in the evacuation of settlements and even military bases in the West Bank that the peace process may have prescribed. A second effort involved increasing demand to limit presence of women in combat units. With significant integration of women conscripts into combat and other roles in the field units, part of the liberalization that I just now described to you, women had gradually assumed about 3% of the combat roles. Nevertheless, this process applied to the secular women, as religious women have traditionally been exempted from military service by law. But secular women's presence dominates the rabbis' concerns. Rabbi Eliezer Sadan, the founder of the pre-military colleges, communicated his concern through this example. I'm quoting: "To practice rescuing a wounded soldier from a tank, you must put your hands under the soldier's shirt and lift him by the armpits. Can you imagine that a male soldier would practice this on a female?" In response to the rabbi's concerns, the military command formulated the appropriate integration guidelines in 2002. In Hebrew it's called Ashiluv Arawi, which developed the rules meant to enable religiously observant Jewish men to serve together with women, but without excluding women. Examples of such rules include separate residential arrangements, or a requirement for wearing modest clothes, especially by women, or arrangement allowing religious soldiers to serve in all-male units to avoid interaction with women. So this policy favored the needs of the religious soldiers as they enjoy a significant quantitative advantage in the military. To a large extent, the old political rivalry between the national religious and ultra-Orthodox groups energized theocratization of the military. Owing to its political power, the ultra-Orthodox sector successfully increased the number of those exempted from military service, and these numbers grew from about 2.5% in the 1970s to 13% in 2010. In 2010. Critical in the religious debate over male military service is the question whether military service breeds secularization at a significant level or not. This dilemma motivated the national religious wing to firmly harmonize military life and religious life. However, more intense interaction between men and women due to the opening of combat roles to women undermines this agenda because of the alleged exposure to immodest conduct and its impact on religious faith. With the rivalry between national religious and ultra-Orthodox, the national religious rabbis were less inclined to compromise on religious issues, especially in light of the possibility that religious trustees or their rabbis might prefer exemption from the military or enlistment into special homogeneously male ultra-Orthodox frameworks that were established in the military to encourage the volunteer recruitment of ultra-Orthodox youth to the military. Rabbi Avraham Baron, Director General of the Union of Arrangement Academies, Igud Yeshivot HaEsder, stated in 2001 when he related to this specific issue of service with women, and I'm quoting, "If religious soldiers have to start questioning whether the IDF is holy," the word holy, it's the word that he picked originally, "they would start enrolling in ultra-Orthodox yeshivas." Of course, this warning had a clear goal: to convince the military to restrict the presence of women in some units. With the creation of a critical mass and of those unwilling to compromise on their demands, this third process began. The high military command's tendency to avoid clashes with the religious leadership, thus restricting the intra-organizational autonomy of the military. Since the 1990s, the senior command has been operating on the assumption that it is dependent on the religious establishment to fill the ranks. This feeling of dependence on the religious has been exploited by the religious leadership to improve its bargaining power vis-à-vis the military. It was especially so on the eve and following the disengagement, Israel's unilateral withdrawal from the Gaza Strip in 2005, with the evacuation of 8,000 settlers from Gaza and more 3 isolated settlements in the West Bank. The perceived destruction of the settlement enterprise by this act of withdrawal threatened to return religious Zionism to status of just another sector in Israeli society, while also undermining the self-identity of many religious conscripts as promoting a national mission. Hence, the plan led many rabbis to call for disobedience of their students, calls that could affect units staffed with large number of soldiers from arrangements, academies, and from pre-military colleges. Therefore, the military command strove to minimize the scope of disobedience by enhancing the dialogue with the rabbis, and later attempt to regain the religious leadership confidence following the disengagement. Because of this, the IDF's willingness to accommodate the religious needs grew again, and by two means, or at least by two means. First, appropriate integration, the guidelines for the shared life of women and religious soldiers, was enforced more strongly. Instead of relying on rules subject to the local commander's interpretation, in 2004, the military established a special administration headed by religious officers. So, ladies and gentlemen, in other words, the policy stakeholders were provided with the power to supervise the policy. In practice, this administration functioned as a kind of modesty guard, inspecting the camps and presenting women soldiers as a modesty problem. Thus, the exclusion of women from some roles continued to increase, and not only from combat roles, but also from training and other auxiliary roles, which required interaction between women and religious soldiers. Gradually, as the Chief of Staff Advisor on Women's Issues stated in 2011, and I'm quoting, appropriate integration has over time become the main, if not the only, perspective through which joint service by men and women is implemented in practice, and that the interpretation of the rules of appropriate integration, she added, mandates religious extremism. At a later stage, the rabbis started to delegitimize women's ability to serve, first to serve as combatants and later even to serve as soldiers, and successfully blocked reforms that the military itself proposed to open more roles to women. Just to give you one expression of this delegitimation, I will use the words of Rabbi Shlomo Aviner, a very famous rabbi, knows a lot about women issues from many perspectives. He issued a call for women never enlist in the army, never. It is forbidden like kashrut, forbidden like Shabbat, and especially forbidden like modesty. We need you, the Jewish woman, to function as a pure and clean woman, and not to undermine your mental foundation. Remember, army service for women in many shape or form is forbidden. Resist the temptation. That was his call for Jewish women not to enlist into the military. Again, not as combatants, but as enlistees. And it was not the only call that could be that could be heard. As for the second mode of accommodating religious demands, the military accepted the expansion of the role of military chaplains from the traditional role of providing religious services for all soldiers to a new role of religious socialization of secular soldiers, while partly supplanting the relatively liberal education corps of the military, which was originally and traditionally and formally in charge of educating or socializing the soldiers. The appointment in 2006 of Brigadier General Avi Ronsky, a settler from the West Bank, appointment which was part of the efforts of conciliation between the military and the settlers following the disengagement. This nomination signified the turning point. Ronsky declared that secular Zionism was in crisis, and therefore, and I'm quoting, part of my job as the chief military rabbi, perhaps the central part, he said, is to reconnect the soldiers with the value of Judaism. This translates into military power because we cannot import the French Legion to fight for us. A clear manifestation of this new role showed itself during the Gaza operation in 2009, when the rabbis joined the troops in the field and worked to what was called spiritually elevate the soldiers by dispensing theological propaganda. Rabbis even steered the appropriate code of conduct in the field by declaring, and I'm quoting, "When you show mercy to a cruel enemy, you are being cruel to pure and honest soldiers. This is terribly immoral." Just to recall, the IDF itself still investigating many cases of unlawful conduct by soldiers. Unlawful conduct, you can translate it to war crimes, but if you don't want to translate it, let's say unlawful conduct, the IDF itself, by itself, still investigating, and there is some linkage between this atmosphere, this religious atmosphere, and the way that the IDF functioned in the Gaza operation. To convince you a little bit more, Israel R.L., an intellectual figure among the settlers, sharply described the struggle between conflicting values in the military by stating after the Gaza operation, and I'm quoting, "The struggle," he said, "is not between the education corps and the chief military rabbinate, but between two spiritual streams. One is represented by those attacking the chief rabbi, leading the IDF to ambivalence and undermining its full faith in its cause, resulting in impairment of the IDF's operational capabilities. The counter stream, whose roots were discovered in Operation Cast Lead," that's the name of the operation in Gaza in 2009, "is based on full identification with the Zionist and national, not necessarily religious, roots of the State of Israel. At the height of the clash between these so-called two spiritual streams," if I quote again Israel R.L., "a senior officer in the IDF Personnel Directorate noted in an interview to Haaretz daily newspaper in 2011 that, and I'm quoting, Jewish identity in the army is undergoing a sharp shift. In the past, the approach was that Orthodox rules were observed in public, and at home, every soldier did whatever he wanted. Nowadays, the army is deciding for you what kind of Jew you will be, a national religious Jew, or if you wish, Orthodox Jew, if I use the very similar concepts. This weakness of the military command paved the road to the fourth process, if you wish to follow from the slide. The growing influence of rabbis and ideologically religious settlers on the ranks that limits the army's freedom of operation in imposing order in the West Bank. Following the disengagement, the focus has shifted from Gaza to the West Bank as the main arena in which major decisions, critical decisions, must be made to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. These decisions should involve withdrawal from most, if not all, of the territory in the West Bank and dismantling part, most, or even all of the settlements, of the Jewish settlements in the West Bank. One of the lessons learned from the Gaza pullout was that the greater the critical mass of religious soldiers, the more limited is the military in deploying troops for evacuating settlements. Some pragmatic rabbis understood this logic on the eve of the disengagement. They also understood that mass refusals of religious soldiers to take part in dismantling the settlements in Gaza in the West Bank might have endangered the religious group's presence and achievements in the IDF. For example, Rabbi Shlomo Aviner, that I mentioned earlier, argued against disobedience through this logic. To leave the army, he said, is to leave the nation. It is disengagement from the people. If you are not inside, you have no influence. You only harm yourself while others take your place, just as with the left-wing refuseniks, related to the several hundred left-wing refuseniks during the second Intifada. Indeed, massive disobedience was averted. This strategy of increasing the presence of religious soldiers in combat units proved effective, and even before the pullout from Gaza. First and foremost, the critical mass of religious and settlers helped create informal practices on the ground. The Sasson report of 2005, the report commissioned by the government of Ariel Sharon to investigate the growth in unauthorized outposts in the West Bank, implied that without the IDF's both passive and active cooperation, the illegal settlements could not have been expanded. For example, IDF soldiers do not enforce the law and have no interest in functioning as policemen, although they are in fact in the area while the police are not. The report said, the commander's spirit sees the settlers' acts of building outposts as Zionist deeds, although illegal, and asked the settlers not to inspect such acts through the eyes of the law. As one example of this spirit, Sasson cited the fact that some IDF officers themselves are residents of illegal outposts, and as such convey a clear message to the troops. No less important is the protest and disobedience arose from within units deployed in the West Bank. Significant percentages of these units are staffed by graduates of yeshiva students, graduates of pre-military colleges, and other local settlers with a very clear ideological bias. For example, in August 2007, a company composed of yeshiva students was ordered to provide what is called perimeter security for the eviction of Jewish families from the market in the Palestinian city of Hebron. Perimeter security means that they don't have to be engaged with the evacuation itself, not face-to-face with the evicted settlers, but just to provide security to the area in which the evacuation takes place. Part of it is to protect the forces and the settlements against the Palestinians, which remained the main challenge to the IDF in the West Bank. Remained the main challenge. I'm not sure, but formally this is the situation. In 12 out of 40 soldiers of this company refused to comply with the order, backed by their rabbis. In 2009, it was the first time in the country's history that soldiers in uniform raised protest signs, in this case against evacuation of illegal settlements. It was two events. Other threats to refuse to carry out orders to evacuate settlements have been also clearly heard since then. There was no better evidence of this undermining of the IDF control over its forces in the West Bank than the order issued by the commander of the West Bank forces in 2011 to restrict information about the army's plans to enforce order on the West Bank settlers. This was a reaction to a well-founded suspicion that the information was being leaked to the settlers by soldiers and officers in order to confound the orders of the top brass. Thus, whether the military and its political supervisors admit it or not, it is safe to assume that a central consideration in refraining from dismantling illegal settlements, despite the Israeli pledge to the United States, is the simple understanding that doing so would open the military to massive refusals from the religious soldiers. And we have some issues even this week. It is not for nothing that the IDF's formal position is that it prefers the army not to be on the front line of evacuating outposts, and that police units would do the job. But the police are incapable of doing the job alone and needs the military, while the military is not so willing to cooperate. So the result is that the illegal settlements are still there. Here the political and cultural agendas are integrated. Deterring the army from evacuating settlements in the future and maintaining an informal cooperation in the ground require a critical mass of religious soldiers in the units deployed in the West Bank. Theocratization of the ranks, including the efforts to exclude women from field units, is an important effort to encourage the religious communities to serve in the military and not to opt for the ultra-Orthodox option track. Intentionally or not, theocratization served the political agenda. Liberalization and theocratization dragged the IDF into a cultural struggle in 2011. For the first time, secular circles showed signs of attempts to contain theocratization. Senior commanders called to curb the IDF's growing religious radicalization. Newspapers published series of articles exposing the new reality of theocratization in the military. At the height, the secular camp had two successes. First, very relevant to yesterday, it drove the IDF to retain the original wording of the Iskor, the memorial prayer for fallen soldier, with Iskor Am Israel, may the people of Israel remember the fallen, and not Iskor Elohim, may God remember, as rabbis tried to practice during the last years. Second, this camp drove the IDF to contain another phenomenon: refusal by some religious soldiers, backed by rabbis, to listen to female soldiers singing solo as part of a military band. The IDF chief of staff decided the religious soldiers will be allowed to opt out of entertainment ceremonies in which women are singing, but will not be allowed to stay out of formal events like memorial services. However, even this compromise drew criticism from some rabbis. For example, Rabbi Eliakim Levanon, head of one of the arrangement academies, very respectful rabbi, commented by saying, and please listen carefully, I will read slowly. The IDF, he said, is bringing close the day in which rabbis will have to say to soldiers, you have to leave those events in which women are singing, even if there is a firing squad outside, and you will be shot to death. In sum, we witness a fight over control over the army, not necessarily only its cultural character. But this conflict between theocratization and liberalization is an asymmetrical conflict in terms of the level of institutional infrastructure, which of course favors the religious networks of yeshivas and colleges. The IDF's levels of dependency on the religious reservoir and the agendas of the two groups. After all, apart from the minor attempts that I mentioned to struggle against theocratization, the secular liberal camp in Israel shows indifference to the theocratization trend. Opting out from the military is the strategy selected by many upper middle class males and females by using their bargaining power rather than struggling over the identity of the IDF. So it is not a wild prediction to argue that theocratization may prevail at least in the midterm period and affect the freedom of action of the Israeli government in deploying the military for politically disputed missions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Yagil. I'm sure that the presentation is raising many questions. Maybe we can move forward if you would like. You listen well there? It's okay? Could you listen well there? You want to stay there? All right.
The best seats in the house.
So somebody from the back over there? Yes, please.
This theocratization that's going on in terms of critical military units, say Matkal or any of the other strike units or Golani Brigade, has that affected their effectiveness in terms of what their missions are?
Not yet, because these units are still staffed by a large number of secular soldiers, even though we can see some expansion of the presence of religious soldiers in some elite units, not necessarily Sayeret Matkal, but other elite units. So we cannot see yet impact of this process.
Thank you. Please introduce yourself when you talk. Bernie?
First of all, thank you very much. Second of all, I apologize for walking in the middle, so it may be that my question is actually, you've already answered it, but that I sort of heard the talk and was fascinated by the talk from the point about the integration of women, or the debate about that, and then the question of the settlements. But it seems to me that, at least from the part that I heard, you're talking about a process which is going on in the military, but it ultimately must be rooted in a changing function of religion itself and the role of women and so forth in the general society. So my question is, I mean, you talk about the theocratic attitude, at least in the part that I heard, as a given, but this move of the theocratic language towards nationalism, this co-optation of nationalist language, this issue that the role of women in the army is, after all, a reflection of the changing role of women in the society and the ideology of the role of women in society. Do you see this as linked, or how is this process linked? And why has religious rhetoric become so powerful from the point of view of the society itself?
It's an excellent question. I see strong linkages, of course. I will mention two. First, as you know, there is Haredization, ultra-Orthodoxization of the Orthodox camp in Israel, and the creation of gradual creation of a new stream called Hardal, National Haredi, or National Ultra-Orthodox. And of course, this stream and the competition struggle within the religious camp between ultra-Orthodox, national religious, and national Orthodox, these three streams, this competition, and I just mentioned it in my talk, but this competition highly affects the approach of the national religious leadership in the military, just to insist not to lose any positions to its rivals. More than that, the issue of one of the very important issues, and I even haven't mentioned it here, is of course the status of religious women in the religious society. And one of the relevant phenomena here is the fact that more and more religious women are trying to join the military service, although they are exempted by law, and not necessarily to civil service, which is the alternative service of for religious women, but to the core of the military service. And it is a matter of a very tough debate between many rabbis and these women, and to some extent these women do what they do against the stream. Just to give you one expression, Israel during the last years was almost crazy in the anti-dodging campaign in the schools. But the Mamlachti Dati, the state networks of religious high schools did not allow the military and other representative of the Ministry of Education to enter into their schools in order to convince women to enlist to the military. So it is an issue. And what many rabbis say very clearly is that the more secular women are joining the military and into significant roles, it encourages the motivation of religious women to follow them and to join the military. So in order to block it, they must first and foremost block the expansion of roles and expansion of status of secular women in the military. So this is at least two dimensions in which the linkage that you suggested is established. Sorry.
You're presenting a position in where, or thesis about one actor, which is the military, having so much power in how that it influences the government, meaning that the government it will not do what the government tells them to do, and then the government will not tell them to do that. Don't you think that it sometimes, at least, is the other way around? The government doesn't want to do certain things, and it has and it can blame the IDF for not doing them. Meaning, you were saying Israel wants to dismantle illegal settlements, but it doesn't do so because the army will not do it. But maybe it's an excuse, or it's not necessarily a contradiction between what the government wants and what the IDF can implement. It's actually what the government really wants it to do.
I agree with you that there is can be a player, but what we have to remember that imagine or assume a situation in which the military say, I have the will and capabilities to do the job. As is said in many other cases, just give me the order. It will create a real dilemma to the decision makers in Jerusalem. But when the decision makers in Jerusalem are themselves not sure that they want to do it, and at least the Olmert government, Sharon government and Olmert government were more motivated and more committed to dismantle illegal settlements than the current government of Benjamin Netanyahu. But the army comes and say at the same time, I don't want to take part in it because it may dismantle my units. I want the police be on the front while the police cannot do it. So the government understands that it has a real problem with several fronts. The settlers, the right wing outside of the settlers, and the military itself as the main executor of this policy. And in very few events in which the government, mainly the defense minister, insisted on dismantling illegal settlements or illegal houses, it was done not by the military, but by special forces of the police, or by special forces of the military, but not the regular military, because the military is not willing to do it, because the issue of information that leaked out, it was done as a surprise attack on the settlers. So, but it is very efficient when you're talking about 1, 2, 3 single houses or some constructions, but not when you're talking about huge settlements like Migron today, or other cases that the government is now considering how to legitimize in order to avoid the need to evacuate.
Yuval, you shouldn't forget that first illegal settlement, first one in Samaria in the middle 70s, was built there because Paris came to, who was the minister for
Minister of Defense,
came to the Prime Minister Rabin with the Chief of Staff Gur, and Gur told him, I cannot evacuate the illegal settlers because my units will not allow me to do that. And it was not so much a real assessment as much as less of willingness to do that. And Rabin gave up, and later on in his diary he said that was my major mistake as a prime minister.
And please don't forget that the units that Guru commanded were almost purely secular.
That's right. Yes, please.
I'm Herbert Grossman. I'm a retired judge. You start off with the assumption that what the religious want is bad, and what you want on the other side is good. So when you talk about creating a critical mass of religious soldiers, if you were on the other side, you'd say, well, there's a critical mass of secular in the army. I happen to be secular, and I don't like religious practices in the army. But now, when you extend it further to talk about politically disputable missions, you assume that they're on the wrong side, and that the secular, or you claim the secular, are on the other side. But you're talking about ethnically cleansing hundreds of thousands of Jews out of their home, and I'm a little insulted that you think that there aren't any secular who are opposed to that too. I mean, this is the biggest ethnic cleansing of Jews proposed since the Nazis. And there are a lot of people now, it's not always bad to be opposed to what the army is doing, politically. We had Vietnam here, and we had a lot of protesters about what the army was doing. And I think it was a good thing. I happen to have been one of the protesters. So if you start off with the assumption that your goals are the right ones, you can see a conspiracy here. But they're just like other segments of society. They have a point of view, and they might and they have a right to express it, and they have a right to join the army too. And I don't know that 20% is a critical mass, or 10%, whatever your figures are, but you're starting off with basic things that you think are right or wrong, and your whole argument is based on, okay, I said enough.
A good point. Yagil. That's the answer.
Okay. First of all, I'm not talking about any conspiracy, and I said it from the beginning. I said that what we see here is a sequence of linear actions leading to theocratization of the military. I cannot say that somebody is sitting in Jerusalem in a yeshiva and say, okay, I have a plan to theocratize the military. I don't have any evidence for it, and if I have, I bring it to you. I know that you are a judge, and you will judge my evidence you can never retire from this job. So you will judge me through your stringent lens. This is not the issue, I think. I'm not saying what is good and what is wrong. I think that creating a situation in which there is a big doubt if the military can follow the will of the political leadership, which was elected legitimately. This situation is a very dangerous situation in terms of democracy. And if we see here that there are more and more limits on the ability of the government to make decisions, because the government cannot be sure that these decisions can be implemented because of the changing nature of the military and the growing stronghold of organized groups outside of the military, in the military, it is a dangerous situation, whether it brings to ethnic cleansing of Jewish or ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. The situation that many orders given by commanders to their soldiers should be mediated by the revision of rabbis who say, do it or not do it. It is a dangerous situation, and I'm sure that you will appreciate it as one who is familiar more than me with the American Constitution. The issue is not protests, and I like protest. The issue is how much the protest is diffused into the military and create a situation in which military discipline cannot cannot anymore be enforced. This is the place, or this is the road to which we are marching, if you take what I said here seriously.
You have to add to that the issue of conscientious objectors in Israel, who for the last 20 years came only from the left, not from the right. And the same argument that Yagil is using now against the protesters on the right did apply to them. When we had the first expressions of conscientious objectors, Yesh Gvul and other groups, the major argument was that how can you expect the military to operate if bodies outside the military, in that case pacifists or peaceniks or whatever, are telling soldiers not to obey the laws, the orders of their commanders. So it works on both hands. Yes, please.
Thank you. That's a fascinating topic you're researching. For long, Israeli society has distinguished itself in its neighborhood for the autonomy of its secular institutions and its efforts towards gender equity and so on. Do you think this kind of a rollback is going to threaten that claim of being different, distinctive, superior to other societies around? Secondly, we do detect your own sympathies when you use words like restricting the IDF's inter-organizational autonomy and so on, which is fine. My question is, are there military sociologists writing currently? I know there are many, but are there some whose own sympathies are on the side of the religious who are entering this, in which case they would be framing this as something like power share? So are there people who are also writing, if I were to prescribe writing by you for a class, would there be another sociologist who is writing to say, well, now we have a balance, we also have the religious in this?
Yeah. It's not a secret that the extent to which Israeli society can be defined as itself as a secular society is not out of question now. Can be questioned, seriously questioned. And what we see, at least in this case, for the first time, is involvement of rabbis, military rabbis and civilian rabbis, in military affairs at a level that we have never seen before. So, at least if we use my mini-level analysis, the secular identity of the military is in question. And as you know, by nature, most of the militaries in the world are secular institutions. Not in the sense that they don't respect religious, but in the sense that they are guided by reason, by rationality, by law that was enacted by representative institutions, and a situation in which rabbis, guided by theocratic motivations, try to guide their soldiers how to act, and have a place and have a status in the institutional bargaining with the military, what to do. Just for example, when Ariel Sharon decided to withdraw the IDF forces from Gaza, and it was a legitimate, we don't have to love it, but it was a legitimate decision by a legitimate government. He called many rabbis, including rabbis of Esder Yeshivot, to convince them, to convince their students to obey. So it is a new situation in Israel, far away from the secular democracy that we are familiar with in Israel and in other countries as well. Yeah, we can talk about something like power sharing. I agree with you. I myself wrote about it when I talk about in one of my papers on the embeddedness of the military within religious communities as a unique model of control of the military. Yeah, we can talk about it, but we have to understand that when this power sharing is overwhelming, the military can use not only its autonomy, but even its very capability to act. Because from one point to another, it is not anymore subject to the government and to the high military command in Tel Aviv, but to grievances of local settlers, local leadership, and this political sharing or power sharing means dismantling of the army as an organized, unified, cohesive framework.
Yes, please.
So I kind of got the sense that you were saying Israelis are kind of using their religious identity to refrain from joining the army. But I feel like the army sort of creates a lot of opportunities for religious people to join by like making positions and giving them, like putting them in places where they don't have to impede on their religious ideals. So don't you think that would kind of inspire more people to want to join the army, knowing that they're making those accommodations for them?
No, it's complicated. The religious group, the Orthodox national religious males are the only ones who are subject to clear obligation to join the military, like their secular males. And what the military is trying to do is to prevent a situation in which these people don't want to go to the combat units, or to avoid the temptation to declare yourself as Haredi, as ultra-Orthodox, join the yeshiva and then avoid military service. So what the military tries to do, and has tried to do it since the 70s or 80s, is to create special arrangement and special frameworks, as I described in my lecture. Not necessarily to theocratize the military, but to do what in many modern armies called diversity management, which is to adapt the environment of service to the specific needs, specific cultural, sometimes linguistic, not in this case, but cultural needs of the group. And and modern militaries do it a lot. Now, there are 2 or 3 more groups which are complicated. The ultra-Orthodox, who are exempted by law, but still the military is trying to encourage their recruitment, at least on volunteer basis, of some of them. And about 20% of the ultra-Orthodox join either the military to very specific units, closed units, homogeneously Haredi units, or to civil service. Not necessarily in the military, but in their communities. Ultra-Haredi women are totally exempted, and there is no doubt about their exemption. Again, some of them are joining the civil service frameworks, but not much. And the last group, which sometimes is the more complicated, and I mentioned before, is the Orthodox religious women who can be exempted by law. Many of them choose the civil service track, and many of them, and more of them, prefer to join the military into the regular frameworks in defiance of their guidance they got from their rabbis and the leaders of their community. And again, the military is trying very hard to accommodate the terms of condition of service and the cultural climate to fit the needs of these specific groups. It doesn't say theocratization of the military, because there is a big difference between arrangements suitable for a specific group, and they are applicable by using the military discipline on other groups as well. These are different different situations. We are talking about theocratization. We are talking about trying to make the military more religious, and this process applied to secular soldiers, not necessarily only to religious soldiers.
Jerry.
Yeah, I understand.
So those who have a class can go, and we'll stay for another 10 minutes.
So I'm Jerry Mueller, a historian from Catholic University. How much of this has to do with the larger issue that you touched upon at the very beginning about the larger interactions between the army and the larger Israeli society. How much of the process that you're describing is because of the withdrawal that you alluded to but didn't say that much about, the withdrawal of secular Israeli elites from commitments to military service and to long-term military service for a variety of reasons, partly demographic. As people have fewer children, they tend to be more risk-averse and less inclined to have their children go into the army, partly because, as you alluded to, Israel's globalization and so on. They may think that they have other things to do besides serve in the army, or besides serve in the army long-term as policy setters. And yet you mentioned that in very elite units, it still tends to recruit from this essentially secular Ashkenazi elite. So how much of it can be described, how much of it, of what you talk about, can be attributed to the, as I say, the withdrawal of this other part of society, together with the demographic growth of the national religious group and the Haredi group, which, as you say, exerts its own influence on the national religious group in certain directions?
Okay, I mentioned part of it in the beginning of my talk. The key, of course, is the drop in motivation to sacrifice among the traditional elite groups, which is mainly the middle class, secular middle class, mainly urban secular middle class, and more prominent among the mid and upper levels of the middle class. These are the group that traditionally led the military. We see a drop in motivation for the reasons that you mentioned and other reasons from the 1970s, and more profoundly from the 1980s, following this first Lebanon war. And what we see there is that the more this group, with its declining motivation, declines its stronghold in the military, the more the military is making efforts to attract other groups. Part of them are the religious group. But the military efforts are not limited to the religious group. The military does a lot with Druze, with immigrants from former Soviet Union, from people, Mizrahi people, Oriental people from the periphery. What is unique here, that in this case, the military is engaging with an organized group which makes some conditions, not necessarily judged as a result of conspiracy, but make some conditions to the military for its for joining the troops. For instance, the expansion of the yeshivot is there, and the establishment, and then expansion of the pre-military Torah colleges, frameworks that help them, the rabbis, to influence their students, but and they sometimes create the old troubles that I described. So of course there is a linkage, and since we see concentration of religious people in very specific units, like in the armor and the infantry, less in the artillery, less in some elite groups, very minor in the Air Force. still minor in the Navy, but with some signs of more growing presence there. It is clear that in these specific units, the religious networks has a lot of bargaining power vis-a-vis the military. So of course, it is one system of manpower, and what the military is trying to do is to court after one group when he's losing other group. But more than that, at least in the 70s, 80s, even 90s, from the military point of view, it was even more convenient to try to attract the religious because he perceived this group as very loyal to the military way. You couldn't see religious among the peace now, the peace now demonstrations. Very few, but it was not.
My relatives, but
Okay.
They were the people.
Yeah.
Your relatives, that was it.
We can talk about Avram Burg, okay, but you understand what I say. Of course, you couldn't see them in the Yesh Gvul or in Parents Against Silence, and later For Mothers. So, from the military point of view, he got a group that unquestionably accept the military way and the military policies in Lebanon and in Gaza and the West Bank. The trouble started when the military itself changed its policies and advocated withdrawal first from Lebanon and later from at least part of the West Bank with the Oslo Accords, and then a tension evolved between the military and the religious group, but it is evolved in the situation that the religious were strong enough to dictate some terms.
Okay, I think that we have time for one more question. So,
Well, this is more a comment. Thank you very much. And you might have gone over this. You were hesitant to use the word conspiracy, and I would understand. But I seem to recall from just when I was there that there was at one point a strategic decision taken by the rabbinic leadership, because at that time there were really only two routes for the religious Zionist youth. There was the Hesder youth arrangement between the yeshivas, and then there were a significant number of religious people who'd been born religious, grown up religious, who were not going to any yeshiva and just going straight into the army and being and perhaps remaining religious, but becoming very military oriented and not having the issues.
Like Aluf General Stern.
Right, exactly. That's one of the people I was thinking of. And there was a frustration that the arrangement yeshivas were not being able to make an impact on the command of the army, because they really went on for just a short period of time. They stayed together, and so there was a strategic decision to create these academies that you mentioned and other routes in order to not only have religious people go to the army but make an impact. And I wouldn't call that a conspiracy, but it was definitely something which happened. And now people who would ordinarily have gone to the army anyway, religious youth would have gone to the army not within the framework of the Hesder program, would be able to do what they wanted to do, but first would go to these ideological training grounds, these paramilitary, these military
Mechinot.
academies, the mechinot, and then that would increase their religious motivation, so to speak, before they took these command positions.
No, I agree with you when talking about this strategic agenda, but I don't see strategic agenda to take control over the military. That's what I said in my response to the judge. I can see many strategic efforts, many strategic decisions to increase influence, and at least, as you related, to be sure that we are not losing our influence on the people because they choose independent frameworks or independent tracks of joining the military, like directly from the yeshiva to the military, and then dislinking any connections between them and the rabbis. So the mechinot is a very elegant way to bring people together, to socialize them in ear, sometimes is more than ear, and to find a way to keep some contacts between the rabbis of the Mechinot and the students, and more than that, to signal to the command, to the senior command, look, we have influence on these people. We have influence on how many people can join us to the Mechina and which tracks they will later choose in the military as combatants or not combatants. So if you want that we will help you, you have to cooperate with us on matter like kashrut, education, and even military deployment.
Thank you. 3 points that I want to mention. One is to start with the end. Next week we're going to have the last event of the year. We're going to host Professor Ephraim Karsh, who is going to talk about the origin of the conflict. He published a new book lately. The topic is, was the Arab-Israeli conflict inevitable? Second, to you, Jerry, if you are interested, there is one professor at Bar Ilan University, Stuart Cohen, who has a slightly different opinion. He believes, and he writes a lot about this religious military issue. He believes that the strength of the military institution as such does change and will continue to change the nature of the religious officers. And therefore, they will be softened, if you want. The more they climb up in the hierarchy, the less religion they will, the less impact they will have as religious people rather than the other. So he's the only one who writes that, and I think that even he began to change his mind a little bit, or soften a little bit. I don't know.
We have a lot of debates.
Right. And thirdly,
from his lips to God's ear.
Right. And thirdly, I want to thank you very much, Yagil, for the excellent presentation and the excellent answers that you gave everybody. You can see that even the students left for the next course, all the adults remained here. And we thank you for that.
Thank you very much.